right, question number 8.
Okay, so I have one, right? So right now I read in Genesis. I started from one coming up the road, right? But so in the old days there was a lot of what we could consider adultery, incest, right? Um, so why that was allowed so freely in the beginning than and it's not allowed now?
Okay. All right. So you're talking specifically with, like, for example, Lot and his. Oh,
Yeah, a lot except we see the man his two daughters and that's a lot that happened from in Genesis.
okay. All right. So the situation with Lot and his two daughters, you see, there are things that happen in scripture that God never commanded, right? That people did, and the Bible just records it. Because the Bible is not necessarily like a sanitized book that doesn't want any negative thing or any seemingly wrong thing to be recorded. The Bible records the actions and the operations of men, which aren't necessarily what God has prescribed, but they're things that people have done. Okay. So, for example, let's say I'm a doctor, I can prescribe medication for you, but then you can go and do your own thing by going on Dr. Google and looking for your own thing, right? I never prescribed that for you, but that's what you're doing. So there's a difference. So, for example, with Lot and his daughters, they believe that there wasn't any other man on the earth, so they um they went with their father and produced two nations. That's not something that God prescribed, but these are things that happen because of the actions of men. Now, what we need to understand is that from the perspective of God's dealings with humanity, God dealt with humanity in a way that ultimately allowed them to come to the understanding that all these things were wrong. This was not my will. This was not my intent. This was not my purpose. The will and intent of God for relationships was that a man would leave his mother and father and the two would become one. Now, obviously, Adam didn't have a mother and a father. So, what Adam was doing in that context was that he was prophesying. He was prophesying in that moment what God's intent was for the rest of humanity, that they would leave their mother and their father and the two would become one. Now, the reason why incest is a problem even now is because over time, what you will see is that the more sin got into the hearts of humanity, is the more that sin resulted in corruption leading to death. So the more that sin works in a person, over time, it produces death. It produces deformity. It produces decay. It produces corruption, all these things. So the longer sin has to work in a person is the more the glory of God and the image of God is marred and defaced. And the more that sin and death enters into humanity. That's why in the beginning you would see where people live for 900 years, 800 years, and then it got shorter, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because sin was working its way into the the bodies of men, the souls of men, producing death. So that the more that they deviated from the will of God, which was that a man would leave his mother and father to become one, the more they deviated from that standard, sin entered the world. And so that's why now incest produces all kinds of deformities and all kinds of defects because it is a manifestation of sin, which produces death.
And it's the same thing for so Abraham and his Hagar, she name
Hagar,
um
yes.
Hagar. So the same concept for her also.
So
So
Hagar was Abraham's wife's servant,
right, and she gave him the permission to
which was
but
which, which was also sin.
right. So but why did God allow that to happen and then he blessed Sarah with a child? Why he
Right,
didn't give Sarah a child in the beginning just to create another nation?
right. So God had already promised to Sarah and Abraham that she would carry the promised child, right? That she would carry the promised son. I think that's in Genesis chapter 17 or 18, one and two of them. But because of, again, their lack of faith and lack of belief, she said, listen, in case this is not possible, I'm already up in age. I'm going to give you my house girl in order for you to have a son with her, and you can have someone to carry on your lineage. But that wasn't God's will and intent. So you see where God has a purpose and a plan for humanity that he was outworking. The promised son would coming through the marital covenant through Abraham and Sarah, right? It wasn't supposed to come through Abraham and Hagar, which was not within the marital covenant. So you have Abraham and Sarah producing Isaac, producing Jacob, producing the 12 tribes of Israel, producing Judah, and then going on to David, and then going on ultimately to Jesus. So the reason why, Sarah was still blessed was because God had already promised that you will have a son and it will come through your wife Sarah. That was a promise that he had already made.
So he made that promise to Abraham.
He made a promise to Abraham. Yeah, let me get it for you. It
So
says,
Abraham knew that, and then he still went and did what he did.
yeah, he did, which means that, there were times when he was doubting, when he was, struggling with his faith, because this promise took 25 years to fulfill, by the way,
Okay.
right? Genesis 18:1 to 15. The Lord showed himself to Abram by the oak trees of Mamre as he sat at the tent door of the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men, right, standing in front of him. And let's go down, go down, go down. It says, verse 9. Then they said to him, where's your wife Sarah? And he said, there in the tent. The Lord said, I will be sure to return to you at this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old. They had lived many years. The way of women had stopped for Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, will I have this joy after my husband and I have grown old? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, how can I give birth to a child when I'm so old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah said, I did not laugh, but because she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. So that's Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 to 15. So he had received the promise 25 years before, you will have a son, you will have a son, right? And your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. But at some point, Sarah doubted, he gave in. They had Ishmael, but God had already promised him, you will have a son, but it wasn't supposed to be through his wife's servant. It was supposed to be through his wife, Sarah. And that was confirmed again in Genesis 18, verse 1 to 15.
And there was also a nation that came off of that union, right?
The
Um,
Ishmaelites,
yeah, Israelites.
Ishmaelites.
Ishmael.
Yeah, the Ishmaelites came through Ishmael, and he had descendants as well. He had children as well, and he had other descendants, yes. Right? So you had through Isaac, you had Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Ishmael, you had other people as well. And then after that, Abraham also had, when his wife died, he also married again and he had other children as well. Right? So yeah. So did I answer that?
So what I take from it is that God allowed sin to happen so that it can be corrected probably in the future.
So
It would be corrected in the future.
it would be corrected in the future, and you can get some understanding from this from Romans chapter 5, right? So let me just read Romans chapter 5, verse 12. It says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, this is Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned. For before the law was given, sin was in the world. So before the law of Moses was given, sin was already in the world from when Adam sinned, right? Good. But sin is not taken into account when there is no law. See that?
Okay.
Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking the command. So from the time Adam sinned, death began to reign. But sin is only taken into account when there is a law, and that law came through Moses.
Okay.
Right? Good. So, nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking the command, as did Adam, who was a pattern of the one to come. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of one man, Adam, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came through the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many. So you see in Romans chapter 5, you will see where there is a comparison between the first Adam who brought sin into the world and the second Adam, Jesus Christ, who brought grace, peace, and righteousness into the world. Okay? So sin is only taken into account when there is a law. That law was instituted in Moses. Yeah? Good. Nice. All right. That was an intense one, but I appreciate that, Stephen. Thank you very much for that.